that is how Paul Stuckey did the introduction to Gordon Lightfoot's tune Early Morning Rain. Now, this is going to be a lesson on how they played it, on the chord progression they used, and kind of the picking they used, except it's going to really turn into more of a lesson on what I call generic finger picking. Stuff that you can apply to any song that you just want to pick through and sing, and have some embellishments and things like that. So mostly what we're going to talk about is different finger picking patterns that fall into the category of Travis picking, or keeping a steady alternating bass going, but and then mixing up when you play fingers, putting in pinches sometimes, putting in fingers between notes. This would be what pinches would sound like, where you're playing a bass note and a melody note. Sometimes just putting fingers in between your thumb, but keeping this going. Having little points of emphasis, like a pinch on the first beat where we play the whole chord, or the pinch on the second beat. So we're going to talk about different finger picking patterns, but mostly the idea behind patterns is to get away from thinking of them as patterns and from just making it up as you go and never worrying about playing it the same way twice. Just keep the ball rolling. Then we'll also talk about some various embellishments that you can do on certain chords. Hammer-ons, and the different ones work on different chords. We've got some James Taylor sounding ones, hadn't intended to actually do that, but so that's what this is going to be, is really a more comprehensive lesson on finger-picking technique that you could apply to thousands of songs. Now, the song originally, Gordon Lightfoot wrote it in the early 1960s and was first recorded by another Canadian group, Ian and Sylvia, but Peter, Paul, and Mary picked it up in 1965 before Gordon ever recorded it, and I do have another lesson on the way Gordon played it. It's quite different, and Peter, Paul, and Mary did something with a lot of songs that is really interesting, and that is they improved the chord progression. And what happened was Gordon did this with basically a 3-chord thing. It was in drop D tuning, and he just used Ds, As, and Gs more or less with some inversions. But they brought in a little bit more of the colorful chords in the key, particularly the minor chords, chords 2 and 3, A minor and B minor. And the song really only uses 4 chords, even their version. We have 4 chords basically, and 4 chords. And so they made it a lot more melodic, and of course with their harmonies, they made it more harmonic with a cooler chord progression than what Gordon used, in my humble opinion. But then they also, what they did vocally was stunning. You know, a lot of times Mary would sing the same thing Paul was doing, an octave higher, and Peter usually had harmony parts. Then sometimes in this song particularly, so I really encourage you to listen to it, Peter Yarrow sang like echoing parts. Hear the mighty winds, oh, da 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 da, echoing, because the song is kind of written in phrases where you kind of have a 2-measure vocal part, followed by 2 measures of just whatever chord, of a fill. In other words, that's one thing else we're going to talk about here is when we get to a 2-measure part of a chord where there is no singing, we'll do something a little bit more elaborate than we would if we were singing. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. First, we're going to just take a look at the chord progression, which is really easy. They did it in the key of B flat by using a capo at the 3rd fret and playing in the key of G. And so really, I'll show you the chords like right now, because basically what we have is a G chord, which would be chord 1 in our key, and A minor, which would be 2 in the key, B minor, which would be 3, and we do have to play the B minor as a bar here to really get the bass notes and everything else that we want. And then we have chord 5, which in the key of G would be D, but a really common and great way to play chord 5 when you're in the key of G, especially when you're coming from A minor, which is what happens in this song. Every time it goes to the D, it ends up being from A minor, and that brings us back home to G. So again, a very basic chord progression, but a great way to play the D chord in all kinds of finger-picking songs is to, from your A minor, just move your second finger down to F sharp in the bass. And that gets us the third of our chord in the bass, the F sharp, and then we leave the D string is now open, and then we keep an A on the third string and a C on the second string, which really makes this chord a D7 with F sharp in the bass, an inversion. Really cool sounding chord. But we can bring in one more thing. We can even use the open E in this chord. And so in my chart, I'll refer to this chord as D9 with F sharp in the bass, although a lot of times I'll probably just call it the D chord that we're talking about. It's always going to be that. A 3-finger chord, similar to A minor, just having your second finger move down to the F sharp in the bass, and then keep using all 3 of the top strings. So if we play the E, it qualifies as a D9. If we don't play the E, it's only D7 because of the C that's on the second string. Okay, so I've got a chart that has the chords and the words. If you just want to strum through it and sing it, we'll talk about that first. I also have the introduction. What I just played, the little 8-measure introduction I played, is as accurate as I could get from the recording. There are a lot of guitars going on in it from the studio recording. Now, every time they would play this, they do something a little different. They're not too worried about making sure the 2 guitars are playing the exact same thing. So it does have this really rich, full sound of just a lot going on. I think on the studio recording I even heard 3 guitars, but because there's some nice leads that are even reminiscent of Jim Croce style songs, where we've got a lead guitar player playing nice little fills and licks. Anyway, so we're going to talk about the chord progression, Paul's intro, and then I've got 4 stanzas, 32 measures, written out of options of things you can do while you're singing it. And that would include some fills on a B minor chord, on an A minor chord, little things like that. The little fill that we hear that we hear in the intro, all of that kind of stuff. So this is going to be, again, a very extensive lesson on generic fingerpicking coming up. Early Morning Rain, the way Peter, Paul, and Mary did it.